In this presentation, we'll talk a little bit more about CSS, about anchor tags, and we'll discuss HTML images. First though, let's talk a little bit about style. Over the span of this course, you're going to be creating a lot of HTML pages. When you do so, it's important to consider how you create them. Ultimately, HTML code is something that, in the future, someone may choose to edit or to review. There are different style guidelines in place to allow your HTML code to be more readable and, as a result, be more easily changed in the future by yourself or by others. One thing you can do is to use indenting when you write HTML code. Indenting can be used to show the nesting of elements, for example, one element inside of another. As we see here on the right, the title element is within the head section, or within the head element, and the text, "The world is round," is within the body element. This helps to make the code more readable and helps the developer to keep track of tag and end tag pairs. It's highly recommended, and another thing that I recommend is to stay within 80 columns. Whatever text editor you're using likely has some sort of mechanism to tell you what column you're in when you're typing, going from left to right. By staying within 80 columns, you're staying within the standard size document that can be used for printing and for development. One other thing that I'm going to highly recommend, because when I receive your homework I'm going to be using it, is to do validation of your HTML. The World Wide Web Consortium provides this site, which allows you to type in the address of a file, an HTML file, and it will validate the HTML. It'll let you know if something is malformed. For example, if you're missing an end tag or if something just isn't formed correctly. I'd encourage you to use this because, again, once I receive your homework, I'll be using it to check out your code. You can also simply upload an HTML file and have it validate that. One HTML element you're going to find yourself using a lot is the anchor tag. Now, what anchor tags do is allow you to create hyperlinks. Links that if the user clicks on them, it will take them to a particular website. The anchor tag is more appropriately known as the A tag. And a basic example is provided here for, in this case, Fox News. An anchor tag has an A tag and a corresponding end of A tag. And it has an href attribute which dictates what site will be loaded when the user clicks on the text between the beginning and ending tags. For example, for this one we have on the screen for Fox News, the user will actually see the text "some news site" highlighted and underlined. When the user clicks on that, it will take them to www.foxnews.com. This is what's called a hyperlink. For us, hyperlinks will normally just involve the href attribute, though there are others that you can use to customize. Recall last time we talked about the idea of a CSS class, and this allows you to apply a particular set of styles to a class of elements rather than just a specific element. And we talked about how we could use the style tag to help do this. Feel free to review the page using the URL at the top of the screen. We also talked about how once we've created a style class, we can refer to that class within our individual tags. As you can see at the example here on the bottom for the UL and the paragraph tag, we can use the class attribute to specify what style class we wish to apply to that particular element. We have CSS classes which allow you to apply styles to a whole class of elements. However, we can also create IDs. IDs allow you to apply a style to a single specific element. Now, IDs are useful for many purposes in HTML, some of which we'll see in the future. However, IDs are different than classes in the sense that a class you can apply to any number of elements. IDs, however, you only use once. For example, and you can check out the URL at the top of the page for a full example. Here we have a style set up for an ID called red text. Notice the pound symbol in front of the word red text. A dot indicates a class, a pound symbol indicates an ID. When we apply the ID to a specific element in HTML, we're only going to do that once. For example, here with the paragraph tag, we're setting the ID attribute to be red text, which is our ID. This can only be done once. You would not use the same ID for different elements in your page. Another thing we often want to do with CSS is we want to center a div. Now recall we mentioned a div element is really just a grouping mechanism. It's a way to take a bunch of HTML elements and treat them as a block. Now we can use CSS to center a group of elements, which is often necessary or even desired depending on our page design. There's an example of doing this at the URL at the top of the page, but here, sort of in short form, we see a style defined for an ID called container, and the three rules that we're setting up here dictate the left and right margins as well as the width of whatever we apply the ID to. In the HTML code, we apply the ID to a div. Now everything within that div will be treated as a group, and the margins will be set, which in this case will mean it will be centered, and the width will be set at 80%. So anything within that div will appear on the screen centered, taking up 80% of the screen size. Again, please feel free to check out the URL at the top of the page for an example. Contrasted with that is a span element. Unlike a div, the span element does not have space above or below the elements within the span. This is more of a tool for doing things inline or in the midst of other elements rather than treating elements as a block. It's simply used to specially format or configure a set of content within other content. Now we see an example of that here. On the left you see a style designation for a class called center1, where we set text to be centered, we set up a background color, and we set up a text shadow, which is a neat little effect we can do with text. The HTML on the right shows you an example of how that might be used. A span tag, which has a corresponding end span tag, has a class attribute, and we apply the class center1. What that means is the text between the span and end span elements, Dr. Stone's schedule, will have that style applied, specifically the style specified by center1. It's important to remember with CSS that there can be multiple levels of CSS, so the rules of precedence become very important. These rules indicate what style is applied first, then second, and so on. It allows individual pages to override quote-unquote global styles. Now the image on the right shows you kind of this rule of precedence, this cascade if you will. We have browser defaults, and if we use external styles they will override them, and if we use embedded styles they will override external styles. If we have inline styles they will override embedded styles, and finally HTML attributes are the final arbiter. I mentioned validation before for your HTML. To validate your CSS, the World Wide Web Consortium provides this site, which will allow you to check your CSS for validation, for valid form. Now I'll use this again when you submit homework, so feel free to check it out. It works very much like the HTML validator. Let's talk about images for a moment. Pictures on a web page are common things, but how do they work? It's important to remember that image files contain picture data and what's called metadata, which is data about the data, in just bits and bytes. Ultimately, all images are just numbers, little ones and zeros taken together, which, when interpreted, can be used to display an image. Some common types that are used on the web include JPEG, GIF, bitmap or BMP, and PNG, which is becoming more and more popular. JPEG is probably the most common image format used on the web, but PNG is quickly gaining ground. To use images on our web pages, we use the IMG element. Now this is a bit different than some other elements in the fact that we have an IMG tag, but it does not require an ending tag. However, it has multiple attributes that we often use. One attribute is SRC, or source, which specifies a URL for the image file that you wish to have appear on your page. Alt, which means alternate, is a text description which replaces the image if it cannot be displayed. Finally, height and width are two other common attributes. They allow you to specify the desired image size in pixels. This allows you some customization if your image is very large and you wish to display it in a smaller format. An example of how to use this tag is shown here on the screen, but you can also use the URL at the top of the screen to see a larger example. The example here on the screen indicates we have two image files, beach.jpg or shark.jpg, that we wish to display on the screen one after the other. And if they can't be loaded for whatever reason, whether it be a network error, whether it be something with the browser settings, we have alternate text which will appear in its place. Here are some examples for the IMG element of using the height and width attributes. And again, there's a web page link here that you can check out if you wish to see this in a full implementation. We can center images on the screen, which is often a common thing we want to do. One way to do that is to use a paragraph tag and set up an inline style. In this case, you would use text-align and you would set that to be center. And again, there's a URL here if you want to check out a full-fledged example. Now, an alternate way to center the image element is to use CSS. The URL here you see on the screen shows you how to do this. The example here shows you three different CSS rules that are applied to the IMG tag. One is to make it a block element, and two are to set the margins based on the window size. These three taken together will center all elements on your page that use the IMG tag. But what if we want to use images as hyperlinks, which is another common thing we often see? Well, the first thing you do is start with the image. We use an IMG tag to specify an image we wish to display. Then what we can do is wrap it with an anchor tag, or more appropriately, nest it within an anchor tag. And we add the href attribute to the anchor tag to specify the link URL. By doing this, we're making the image a hyperlink. If the user clicks on it, it will take them to the page www.atari2600.com. The URL of this full-fledged page is available on the screen, so feel free to check it out. This is the end of our presentation. Next time we'll talk more about formatting, both with and without CSS.